we do like to capture. We like to capture these conversations because they're a great resource for us to share after the fact. This is part 4. This is the 4th session in a series we're calling Let's Talk Law. The first session focused on expungements and expunctions. Session 2 was the role of the public defender. We actually featured our own Guilford County public defender, John Neiman. Session 3 was about probation, parole, and plea bargains. And tonight's session is called Can They Do That? And it's going to focus on the 4th Amendment. I believe our speaker is also going to touch a little bit on the 5th Amendment, possibly. So thank you all for being here. As stated previously, this session will be recorded and we're going to be able to share that recording with you. Just a quick note, if you could please keep yourselves muted to allow speakers to be fully heard and just to kind of minimize distraction, we would greatly appreciate it. Sue, this is a series developed by the Human Rights Commission, the Greensboro Human Rights Commission. Commissioner Sue Polinsky is the person kind of behind the wheel. We have several others, Kentia Smith, and several others that will likely join us throughout the evening. But I'm going to hand it over to Sue to do an introduction of our speaker. And just thank you all for being here and enjoy.
Good evening. Thanks for coming. This is the 4th episode of our Let's Talk Law series. And we're excited that Steve Friedland's with us tonight. At the end of each program, you're going to see a link for a survey. And I want you to know we read them. And one of the questions on the survey is, can you give us a topic you'd like to see covered in this series? We've had the same topic suggested by multiple people, and it all had to do with what happens if I get a traffic stop and this happens, and can they let a dog sniff my car? And it went, and we sat and thought about it and talked about it, and then we talked to Steve Friedland. He said, you're talking about the 4th Amendment. And I went, I guess we are. We're not lawyers. But Steve graciously agreed to lead tonight's discussion. And it's fascinating because we've met with him once to go over kind of how it will roll out. And it's fascinating. I think you're in for a real treat. Steve Friedland is a founding member of the law school faculty at Elon Law, which is a real good thing for Greensboro, who taught at several law schools. He served as an assistant U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia and as an assistant director of the Office of Legal Education in the Department of Justice. So he was an AUSA and he was in the Main Justice. I mean, come on. He's an accomplished scholar. He's published everywhere and lots of them. He was elected to the American Law Institute, served as a member of the Board of Trustees of the Law School Admission Council, and is a current member of the Lexis Advisory Board. He's won numerous teaching awards at several law schools over 3 decades and was named one of the best law teachers in America by the Harvard University Press book, What the Best Law Teachers Do. He's an internationally known speaker on legal education. He's worked with the Japan Legal Foundation to develop law schools in Japan and with Afghanistan law schools to improve the rule of law in that country. He's lectured to thousands of students across the country preparing for the bar exam. He's got a JD, Juris Doctor degree with honors from Harvard Law, and as well as a Master of Law and a Doctor of Science of Law from Columbia University Law School, where he was a Dollard Fellow in Law, Medicine, and Psychiatry. I could go on, but we'd be here till tomorrow. Steve is not only incredibly qualified for this discussion, to lead this discussion, but he is a lot of fun. So without any more, let me just do a little bit of housekeeping. Questions. We are going to have a Q&A, and if you'll put your question in the chat and direct it to either Jody or me, we will get your question asked. And there may be a little interactive going on tonight, so get ready to join. The keystroke Alt-A or Option-A on the Mac will mute your microphone or unmute your microphone. So let's stay muted so we don't have to listen to my dog bark in the background. Enjoy, get ready to enjoy. It's going to be great. Steve, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Sue. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited about talking to everyone. We have a nice small group, and I do hope it's interactive. I don't want to wait for an hour if there are questions. So I'm going to actually ask questions as we go through. I think that's more fun and works better. And I'm going to show you some PowerPoint slides. And my goal is first to acquaint everyone with the Constitution. And then second, to talk about how specific amendments affect us in everyday life and what we could do about it. And let me just say, I think what we're talking about today should be in every high school in the state, around the country. So everyone knows what their rights are before they interact with the police, before they're investigated for crime, not after. So here we go. Let me share my screen. And if there are any issues, please let me know. We're going to talk about the Constitution, police, and prosecutors. So I've already said what my goals are, and it's really just having a conversation, creating a dialogue, and then to learn something about the Constitution, police, and prosecutors. And as Sue said, I used to be a prosecutor in Washington, D.C. I have also done defense work, so I've seen both sides. And I've taught criminal law for the last several decades. And I can tell you this, I don't call it the criminal justice system. I think that's assuming something. I call it the criminal system. And I think doesn't matter where you are in the ideological spectrum these days, there are issues and flaws within the system that many people, many people think we can fix. So here we go. A lot of what goes on in policing, in prosecuting, and in criminal cases involves the Constitution of the United States. This is the grandmother or granddaddy of all laws. It's the supreme law of the land. And it's really helpful to go back and see if we understand what it says and what it means. So here we go. And if people want to use the chat, I am fine. The first four words of the Constitution are, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Any takers on that? Is that true or false? Okay, we got some true, we got some false, that's fine. And the answer here is gonna be false. This happens to be the first four words of the Declaration of Independence, which is really saying, hey, Britain, we're out of here. Here's the Constitution's preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. So there's a very different approach in the Constitution than the Declaration of Independence, which was designed to say, we're no longer going to be part of you, Great Britain. So interestingly, the Constitution's preamble had a very modest goal, form a more perfect union. I say that with a little bit of tongue in cheek. Article 3 of the Constitution contains the Bill of Rights. True or false? And actually, it says what it is there. Somehow it came up together. And this is false. The first three articles of the Constitution are about the powers of government. Article 1 is the power of the legislature. Article 2 is the power of the executive. And when I say executive, what do I mean? That's actually the president. When we talk about the executive branch, its powers all lodged in the presidency. And the third article is the judiciary. How many courts were formed by the Constitution? How many federal courts are required in the federal Constitution? Yep, you got it, Sue. It is one court. That's it. It's the Supreme Court. That's it. All the other courts are actually created by Congress. All the federal inferior courts. And we'd love a job in these courts. How come? It's for life, as long as we have good behavior. So it's kind of a nice job. And my favorite his favorite comment by one of the justices from a while back. The justice says, if I die, prop me up and keep on voting. They like their job so much. They didn't want to finish their job even when they died. But that's not quite what they get a chance to do. Okay, the states can have their own constitutions, true or false? Good, and that's true. It's true. If there's a conflict between the state constitution and the federal constitution, which wins? And the answer is going to be the federal constitution. That's the supreme law of the land. But there is a North Carolina constitution. So I just want you to know states have their own, and North Carolina will say based on our constitution. Often the rights are more expansive than under the federal constitution, or they'll reiterate the same things. So states have their own constitutions, but the major one in our country is the federal one, and all states must be consistent with that. Okay, here's a fun one. The president has the power to declare war. And a lot of people are going to say, Jody, yes, and I'm glad you said that. And believe it or not, only Congress has the power to declare war. The president in Article 2 is the commander in chief. But President Biden can't declare war against Russia even if he wants. It's only the legislature. So here's the interesting question. When was the last war, declared war, we've had in this country? When was the last declared war in this country? Any takers? Yes, there's a lot going on. And Sue, you have it. Believe it or not, World War II was the last declared war. So what was Korea? What was Vietnam? What was Afghanistan? What was Iraq? Answer, they weren't wars, they were conflicts. So believe it or not, the president, especially in the last 20 years since 9/11, has amassed a lot more power. And so I think you're more than an excellent guesser. I think you know a lot there, and I'm impressed. So bottom line, our last declared war was World War II. Okay, true or false? Congress can't borrow money when its debts are twice the amount of its total revenues. And this is something that we probably all are kind of aware of. And it's because there is absolutely no limit in the Constitution about how much money Congress can borrow. And that is why, in part, we are in a lot of debt. There is no stopping our country from borrowing money. Imagine if you had a credit card and you never had a deadline to pay it back. Welcome to the United States Constitution. So this is made up. The answer here is false. Congress can borrow money anytime it wants, and it does. Okay, here's an interesting question. And I ask my students this a lot, and I like this question. Marijuana use is legal in Virginia, Colorado, Oregon, and several other states. True or false? Any takers on that? And the answer, even though many people are going to want to say true, is false. It's false because under federal law, marijuana is still a Schedule I drug and unlawful. The Supreme Court has held that before medical marijuana has been used in states, sorry people, if you think that it has medicinal qualities, the federal government basically is prohibiting it, saying it has no medicinal qualities. A lot of people and a lot of states now disagree, but it is still unlawful in the federal law. And what we know is when there's a fight between the feds and the states, in this corner, weighing 845 pounds in the blue trunks, the federal government. In this corner, weighing 65 pounds in the orange trunks, states. Whenever there's a conflict, the feds are generally going to win. The feds are generally going to win. So know that marijuana use is really not legal in Virginia, Washington, D.C., Colorado, Oregon, state of Washington, and I can go on. How come? It's because that marijuana use may be legalized from the state law, but it's still criminalized in the federal. How many governments do we have in this country? We actually have two. We have two sovereigns, states and feds. And can each sovereign charge somebody with a violation of law? Yes, even if it's the same act. So we have two different governments. So just know that marijuana use is not really legal. Yep, and municipal governments are actually considered in our system as part of states. You're right, they're subdivisions of states, and they're going to be considered part of the states. So, yep, keep responding. Thank you for that, Jody. The chat's now visible to all. And I'm fine if you put this in. This is something that is not taught in schools. And I think, again, when we talk about the kind of education people should have, it's useful to know a little bit about our Constitution. That's going to be important here. Okay, just a couple more questions on the Constitution. How about this? The Constitution excludes protection for obscene speech. Can someone be prosecuted for obscenity? So the Constitution doesn't exclude protection for obscene speech. Many people have heard of the First Amendment, and that does protect the freedom of speech. But does that protect all speech? And here we have the Constitution, which is an outline. You got it, Sue. You can't yell fire in a theater unless there is a fire, right? You can yell theater at a fire if you want, but that's not going to get you far. So the Constitution, according to the Supreme Court, does not protect all speech. Can you think of a type of speech other than obscene speech that's unprotected and can be made criminal? And every day, by the way, there are police officers online in chat rooms trolling for people who are involved in child pornography and other kinds of speech. Yeah, I see hate speech. That's a big one. That can enhance penalties. Yeah, offensive speech. Is that prohibited? And believe it or not, offensive speech is protected. Offensive speech is protected. But how about defamation? How about conspiracy? How about solicitation? Yep, thanks, David. It is conspiracy. There you go. Yep, and Sue, slander and libel are the two types of defamation. Slander verbal, libel is written. You got it. So many people think I have my First Amendment rights to speak, and the answer is not always. You don't, and the government can prohibit certain kinds of speech or provide less protection for other types of speech. Okay, last question. There are at least 3 references to slavery in our document that's the core of our democracy, the Constitution, excluding amendments. And I bring this up, and Jody and David, you have it, that the answer here is true. So the greatest document we have in our country, the one that has protected our democracy, actually legitimized slavery. There really was a compromise in the Constitution. Article 1 states the whole number of free persons and 3/5 of all other persons, which was including the slaves. So Jody, I think you, or Sue, you put that down, you bet, the 3/5 compromise here. And Article 1, Section 9, the migration or importation of persons shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to 1808. This is saying, even if Congress wants to change things before then, they can't. That is, it's protecting slavery, which many people don't understand that this is what our Constitution did. And it really was a compromise document. And the third was about escape. That is, when a slave escaped, they were still a slave just because they escaped into a free state. So, quick history of the Constitution and what it was, and it's still our governing document. And here's the thing, it's very thin in terms of what it says. It is not like a code. So the interesting thing in this document is it takes interpretation. So who interprets the Constitution? And the answer is the courts did a power grab. It doesn't say in the Constitution who gets to interpret it. And our 4th Chief Justice, John Marshall, in a case that very few people, hardly anyone understands, called Marbury versus Madison. And he basically said, we get to interpret the Constitution. So we're now getting a Supreme Court nominee. Why is that important? Because this person perhaps for the rest of their life, will be able to interpret the Constitution. And one of my favorite things that occurred on the court in the years back was Justice Brennan, who would call all of his law clerks in front of him and say, what's the most important thing you need to know about the Supreme Court? And all the law clerks who just graduated from law school said, I don't know, what could it be? And he held up his hand and did this. Why is he holding up his hand and showing them 5 fingers? And the answer is because it takes 5 votes to get something done. You got it, Sue. And that's what he wanted them to know. You can be the best justice of all, but if you're always writing a dissent when you're in the minority, you're not really making law. You're not really changing or at least interpreting the Constitution. So, any questions so far about the Constitution? And I'm fine pausing as we go through. We have a small group. It's fine if it's interactive. It's also fine if you're making dinner at the same time and listening in. That works as well.
I was going to say, Steve, some of these questions are on the naturalization test. I have to take that in March, and I'm not doing well, so I think I better study.
And what I would say to you, and I'm glad you said that, Jody, I think a lot of Americans would get almost all my questions wrong. And I think if anyone's in America, we all talk about the Constitution, right? And I want my rights. Everyone says, I know my rights. And I'm thinking, not really. And people say I have my right to free speech. No, it's a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot of case law interpreting what rights are under the First Amendment. And it's all about the judges and these long cases, sometimes 100 pages long. And most Americans are allowed to bypass all this. And that's why I say, I think all students in North Carolina, I'll be happy if it's Guilford County, who should know this. So this is something that everyone should know. I have a whole bunch of questions when I teach constitutional law for my students. I give them this at the very beginning of the class. And it kind of humbles them because they don't know it either. So just because you make it to law school, it does not mean you have any understanding of how the Supreme Court works or what the Constitution says. Okay, so we are going to move on to police and prosecutors. So a couple more questions. Police and prosecutors are part of the judicial branch, judicial and executive branch, or legislative branch. I'm going to give you multiple choice instead of true and false. What do you think? Don't you love multiple choice? And yes, Irene and David, thank you. You got it. Many people get this wrong. The executive branch enforces the law. That's its job. And police and prosecutors enforce the law. So many people are confused about where police and prosecutors go. Police investigate law and prosecutors charge crimes and basically enforce the criminal law. That's their job. It's not the legislative branch. What's that job? To make the law. And the judicial branch's job is to interpret the law. So the judiciary interprets, executive enforces, and legislature makes. Okay, we're on a roll. Here we go. Police have no discretion in enforcing the law. Have policies set by the police chief that have to be followed, even if it violates state law, must follow the constitutions, North Carolina and US, and have leeway in following the Constitution depending on how serious the case is. What's the best answer here? Yeah, you all got it. You're good on this one, Sue and David. I think we're ready for Jeopardy tonight. But this is a big one. Police have discretion in enforcing the law. And in many of the recent cases we've seen over the last couple of years, it's taken people to protest. Even back to 10 years ago, the killing of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman. And in a lot of cases recently where police have killed unarmed Black men, and they have discretion in how they enforce the law. That's what you need to know, that police and its discretion are really significant. And there's really not a standard or guidance on how police do it. And they have to comply with state law. And the big one is C, they have to follow the Constitution. There's no leeway on the in following the Constitution. Okay, police functions. And I want you to see police do two different things. And this we can have a chat about for an hour. And the reason why I say this is police are supposed to help with community safety. If someone falls in their home and they're 97 and they can't get up, who are they calling? If a cat's up the tree or a house has an open back door, who are they calling? Or there's a tree falling on the house, who are they calling? And the answer generally is the police. It's called 911. That's what most people will do. The second thing police do is crime interdiction. So police have a lot of roles. And one of the issues today, that's for another conversation, is how do we promote community safety with crime interdiction? Should the police be doing all these functions? And some people are suggesting, and the words defund the police have been used, but I think the real issue is how do you change what the police do, given the resources police have? So first of all, I think a lot of the issue is going to be about resources, and then we can talk about mental health situations. We can talk about traffic stops, etc. And some communities are trying to change what the police do, but there's been a lot of obstacles. Paterson, New Jersey is trying to create a new approach that creates trust in the police. 30 years ago, police officers used to walk the beat and walk through the community so people knew them. It's changed. So there you go. Sue has been to Paterson and lived there. That is now on the forefront of reform. So what's going to happen, we don't know. And here's what I would say too. Police have a tough job. And how do we create trust in the police? And that's going to be an interesting issue. So I'm not giving any answers. I'm just trying to say there are lots of questions. And yep, Billy, I think you're right. There's a lot of myths and rumors and a lot of hats they're asked to wear. You bet. And a lot of things that come up that how do we negotiate? I think that's a community decision. And we certainly say, yep, with teachers too. And here's another thing. I think one last comment on this. If we value something, we should pay them. And police and teachers, we don't perhaps pay them the way we want to value them. So in any event, I'm going to move on. Police do traffic control, mental health, drug addiction. You can see all the things police have to do. Okay, so here's an underlying issue when it comes to criminal law. It's the right to freedom of action versus the right to security. And for everything we talk about in criminal law, what should be a crime? How should we look at it? This is going to be the underlying tension. And there are certain people who want more security and other people want more freedom of action. So when we ask about policing, this is an underlying tension that we have to address. Okay. And who decides? Good question, David. I think each jurisdiction, it's the legislature. And here's one thing I would say. Do legislatures repeal crimes? And the answer is rarely. Is adultery a crime? It was pretty widespread as a crime 30 years ago. It's still on the books. Legislatures don't repeal it. I've asked my students, the younger generation, should adultery be a crime? Guess what they said? Overwhelmingly. I think you pretty much know. No, that's between two people. It shouldn't be a crime. 30 years ago, the family unit was considered really important to the state. And we can see the change too in drugs. A lot of the students say just legalize drugs. So it could be generational, it's cultural. There are a lot of issues about that. Yep, and the Uniform Code of Military Justice, they're a crime. So here's what I want you to do. You ready? I'm going to give you 3 crimes. And I'm going to add a 4th. I'm going to add a 4th. Instead of possession of marijuana, make this actually possession of cocaine. Can you rank which is worse of these 3? Adultery, river pollution, and possession of cocaine. Which is the worst, second worst, and third worst here? this in a way goes to your question, David. I want you to see that we have some interesting rankings. Okay, we have 2 pollutions. Anyone else? An interesting switch between the Polinskis in terms of cocaine and adultery. And good, someone asked me morally or legally. And I'm going to ask legally. Which are worse legally? And it's interesting, everyone's putting pollution. I got a lot of pollution in there, but our society yet is not prosecuting river pollution the way possession of cocaine is prosecuted. So I just want you to see that the legislature gets to determine first what the order is and whether it's even a crime. Yep, and crack versus powder, you got it. Possession of cocaine was different, at least. It's now they're setting the sentences, they're trying to make them more equivalent because it was actually having disparate effects on minority communities. So, and I am fine with David being a lawyer and coming in and participating. That's great. I welcome other perspectives and perspectives from lawyers and non-lawyers. I just want you to see when we talk about criminal law, what's a crime has been determined by the legislature. We may not agree. And what the legislature is really doing is valuing different actions. And a crime is something that's morally blameworthy behavior against society. So now I would ask you, is adultery morally blameworthy behavior against society? River pollution, and notice I didn't say how much, and possession of marijuana. And Crystal, it depends on the jurisdiction about how they're doing it. I think they're now starting to decrease the amount of time for drugs. We had a war on drugs 20, 30 years ago, and that created mass incarceration in our prison system. We are 5% of the world's population, and we have, based on numbers I've heard recently, almost 25% of the world's prisoners. So we have a lot of prisoners relative to our population. So anyone think adultery is worse? Do I hear possession of cocaine? And it's fine, there's no right answer. I just want people to see. And I think Crystal and Terry and putting in crack versus powder, I could even ask you now, do you think one is worse? What does it mean to be worse? And we can talk about that, but I want you to see what crime is. It's morally blameworthy behavior against society. So here's a related question. You have 2 people and they live together, and boyfriend hits girlfriend. Girlfriend calls 911. It's called domestic violence. And they interview the girlfriend, and then the prosecutor files charges against boyfriend, but girlfriend says, I love this person, I don't want to bring charges. Can the prosecutor still bring suit? Can the prosecutor still bring suit in the situation I just gave you? And David, you got it. There's a problem with the witness. But the answer is yes, because that's a crime against society. Even though there is one victim, criminal law is about everyone. It's a crime. That person can do it again. And we also want to send a message to everybody. We don't want people doing this. So the big issue, of course, is can the prosecutor make a case when the main victim is not testifying? And you got it, David. There's going to be a problem with evidence, but some prosecutors will look to see if they can prosecute, even if the complaining victim says, I don't want to go forward. Okay, so this is what a crime is. We just talked about it. It's morally blameworthy behavior against society. You need acts and mental states. And here's what we look at in our society. Punishment really is 2 things these days: retribution and deterrence. Rehabilitation is not what the United States practices. We're starting to do a little of it, but not a lot. We are retributive and we punish, basically. That's what we do. Okay. Any questions so far or comments? So let me show you one way to analyze what's a crime. It's my next slide. Here we go. If I can get to it. Yep. There's $20 sticking out of an ATM machine. First, would you take it? Would you take it? I ask this of my students all the time. And ethics, by the way, is what happens when no one's looking. That's really what I think it is. So I've got a heck no. I'd leave it for a homeless person. I'd bring it inside. It's at night. And let me add one more thing. You ready, Sue? It's at night. The bank's closed. There's no bank nearby. And the camera is broken. Change anybody's mind? So I want you to see many people are going to take it. And now, of course, is that a crime? That's going to be the question. Is that a crime? And of course, people who take it probably will say it's not crime. And yep, it's a federal bank, because I should say they're federally insured. Crystal asks, is it federal? And that's why Crystal in Colorado and all places where they have marijuana that's quote unquote legal, they don't put their money in the bank. They have really, those mattresses have lots of money in them. Or that's why Bitcoin gets going, because they can't put it in a federal bank. So is it a crime? I think you're taking somebody else's property, right, Terry? So it's probably at least going to be theft. But for many people, it's hidden in the agreement you signed to get an ATM card. There's probably something in there. Yeah, we have something called lost property, and we have something called mislaid property. They're different characteristics. I just want you to see this is the kind of question that everyone's going to have a rationale for as to whether it's allowed or not. And the legislature could make this a crime or say it's not. They can deal with it however they want. Okay, I'm done with the background. Questions on background, we're going to get to criminal procedure, which is really the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, and the Sixth Amendment. So any questions, I'll stop if there are, or we can just keep on going. Okay, so here we go. Those three amendments to the Constitution give people who are charged with crimes rights. So if you say, I want my rights, these are amendments that give people rights. And interestingly, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, only apply directly to the states. It wasn't until the 14th Amendment was enacted that the justices started saying there is something called the incorporation doctrine, where these rights also apply to states and municipal governments. So now these amendments apply to states pretty much and municipal governments. So the Fourth Amendment limits the government. Now, how about if you go into Elon and Elon searches you? Can you claim a violation of the Fourth Amendment if Elon law searches everybody who comes in? And the answer is no, because it's only the government search and seizure that's Fourth Amendment is protecting us against. It's protecting us against the government. And when I say government, I'm talking about state, municipalities, or federal governments. So different levels of government. And not everybody in the government, but somebody who's investigating or has investigative power. So the Fourth Amendment is what we're focusing on. And notice what I wrote here: no unreasonable searches and seizures. So does the Fourth Amendment allow the government to search and seize? Yes, they can, as long as it's not unreasonable. That's the key. If it is unreasonable, what happens? There's a penalty. It's called suppression of evidence. And in cases in Greensboro and around Guilford County and around the state and the country, there are motions to suppress evidence, meaning asking the judge to throw out evidence. So, and David asked me in the chat, can Elon use government resources to enforce their action? Yes, and it really depends on how much they use, because they may be a government actor. But for the most part, Elon's not going to be considered a government actor they'll have their own limits. And remember, there's federal law that limits Elon, but it's not the Supreme Court. It's not the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment does not limit private actors unless Elon was considered a government actor. Okay. Fifth Amendment is about statements. And we all have heard and watched on TV Miranda. So I hope to reach Miranda a bit as well. And the Sixth Amendment is once a trial or at least the adversary process starts, this is about the right to counsel. So here we go with the Fourth Amendment. And here it is. The right to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. And here's a second clause about warrants. The police can get a warrant, and as there are two types. They can arrest or search. So search and seizure means really search people or seize them. Search premises as well. So searches have two types. Searching a person, or let's say a house or a car, and seizure is really talking about detaining people and arresting them. That's what the Fourth Amendment's about. So the first question everyone needs to know for the Fourth Amendment is, was there a government stop, search, or seizure? The government can't do this on a hunch. The government can't do this on their own. So here we go. I'm driving along. It's time to get practical now. Woo, 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 woo. And I don't know about you, I don't like having the police behind me. I'd rather go in a different lane. The police pull me over. Woo, 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 woo. Can they do so on a hunch? Can they do so on their own? And the answer is going to be no. They are not allowed to do so. There has to be a reasonable suspicion. There has to be, sometimes defined as probable cause, to stop someone. But what counts? A traffic violation. Anyone here ever change lanes without a turn signal? Have a tail light out? They can stop us for those reasons. And Greensboro for a while had a rule, we're not going to stop anyone for just not using their turn signal. Now, what's the problem with the police being able to stop us with a very low requirement? And the answer is police sometimes, and it's documented, yep, precursory stop, you got it. It's a pretext, as Billy said. Great. You're right on point. Police, as long as they have a reason to stop us that's lawful, can stop us really for another reason. And so this has been documented in North Carolina. Are you more likely to be stopped if you are Black? And the answer says, based on a review of 20 million traffic stops, North Carolina kept all of its traffic stop law, and they included demographics. So several people, one at UNC, one at the University of South Carolina, looked at these 20 million stops, and they found out that you're more likely to be stopped if you're Black. How about searched? Yep, you're more likely to be searched if you're Black. How about finding contraband? And the answer is no. You're not more likely to have contraband if you're Black than if you're white. So the police can stop us, but there has to be a reason. Now, we can ask them what the reason is. They may not tell us. They're not required to say, here's the reason. They may say, why do you think I'm stopping you? Which I think is a technique that a lot of officers use, because they want us to admit, oh, I might have been driving too fast, or I was changing lanes, or I was swerving. So you can ask, Sue, officer, why was I stopped? The one thing I would say to you is, arguing with the police officer often, most always, does not have a good result. It doesn't lead to anything better. So I think being respectful, not to say that they always will be, but I think that probably is a good way to approach it. Second, as a practical matter, where should my hands be in today's day and age? Where the officer can see them. I'm going to put them on the wheel, and I'm going to put them high. So you should not be bending over, looking around, because what's the officer perhaps going to think, especially if it's at 2 a.m.? They might think something's going on. So I would roll down the window and put my hands on the wheel. If it's a lawful stop, they can pull us over and come to the side window. And I would, again, keep my hands up on the wheel if I can. Now, the officer is going to say, can I have your license and registration? Are they allowed to do that? And the answer is yes. Driving is a privilege in North Carolina. Driving is a privilege. They can ask for our license and registration. How many people are driving in North Carolina without licenses? I don't know the exact number, but it's upwards of almost 1 million people. So driving without a valid license, it's really an astronomical number. And this can lead to a misdemeanor and jail time. It's a misdemeanor, I think, in the 3rd degree without any other circumstances. It's a lot higher if there are, if it's more. So it may not be 1 million people, but it's a lot of people who are driving without a license. It's a very high number. And that can cause problems. Now, the officer says, hey, Friedland, get out of the car. Do I have to get out of the car? And based on case law, the answer is going to be yes, including the passenger. And a major reason is this is to protect the police for their safety. So they can ask me to get out of the car. They're allowed to. Now, the officer looks into my car and wants to search around for my driver's license if I said it's on the floor in there. Can they do that? And the answer is going to be no. They're not allowed to search my car generally unless they have probable cause to believe that there's contraband in the car. Now, can the officer ask me to search my car? And Jody, this is another exception. So they can search without permission if they have probable cause to believe there's contraband in the car. But Billy, you have it, there has to be consent. And here's the interesting thing. If an officer is asking me to do so, am I going to consent? And Sue asks about the trunk. Can they make me open the trunk? And guess what, Sue? The answer again is no. They can ask you, hey, would you mind if I looked in your trunk? Can you open it for me? That's why they might say it. And you have the right to say no. When it comes to your car, you often have the right to say no. What percentage of people say, sure, go ahead and search when they ask? What do you think? Including people who might have a pound of Coke, a kilo of Coke in their trunk. And the answer, and this is again, who knows the exact number, but police estimate 60 to 70%. A very high percentage. And a lot of people say, I have nothing to hide. What's the problem with that? One, there may have been someone else who used your car, and there may have been something in your car that you didn't know about that is unlawful. Studies show that people commit at least 1 to 2 misdemeanors a day. They don't even know they're doing it. Or I shouldn't say misdemeanors, crime infractions, i.e. jaywalking and things like that, that we might not even consider a crime. So people often say yes when they have the right to say no. Okay, so they can say step out of the car, search the car, generally no. Now, can they call for a dog during a lawful stop? And the answer is yes. It is not a search. Police generally cannot search or seize without reasonable suspicion or probable cause. And a dog that's sniffing on the outside, that's not a search. So there's a canine unit in just about every jurisdiction. Where do they get these dogs? And the answer, believe it or not, is mostly Europe. They're mostly imported from Europe and they're highly trained. How much does one of these dogs cost? Without training, it's generally $5,000 to $6,000. And with training, it could be the amount invested in them, they're worth about $15,000, maybe even more. And they're generally trained for one thing. It could be drugs, it could be bombs. And if they find drugs, they alert, they stop, and they get a treat, generally chewing on a ball. So where do these dogs live? They actually live with the police. You don't want to pet them. They're trained to take people's arms off, but they're really good about apparently with families and kids, as long as it's with the police and they know them. So yeah, they come from the Netherlands, speaking Dutch. They usually add English commands or whatever language the police officer is speaking. And dog sniffs are not a search, but can they hold you there for the dog sniff if it's going to take an hour? And the answer is going to be no. They can keep you there for around 20 minutes. That's about it. Just 20 minutes they can keep you there. That's about how long it'll take for a sniff. Now, it's 2 a.m. Yeah, waiting an hour, that's no good. That's called a seizure. They have to have a reason to hold you for an hour. No good. And if the dog alerts, now what? What happens to your car if the dog alerts? Now the police have probable cause to search the inside of the car. If the dog alerts for contraband, the police can now search without permission. Usually at a search, if the police say, can we search your car? And you say no, they're going to have to let you go. They're going to have to let you go. So I don't know how many stops they will. Crystal asks, is that documented? Yeah, they're going to talk about what happens each day. They're going to write it down. I don't think dog sniffs are used that much. It really depends if the police believe there may be contraband in the car. The police are going to call a dog because, and Sue asked an interesting question about smelling, because the police can't go and search on their own. They're not allowed under the amendment. Now, Sue gives me a nice hypo. Police say, I smell marijuana. Is that probable cause? And the answer, Sue, is it used to be. That was enough. And here's what happened. They pull someone over and the window be rolled down a little bit. Smoke will be coming out. They smell it. That would be probable cause to arrest the person and then search the car in the old days, especially if they smelled it coming out of the car. There's a problem in North Carolina. What's legal now in North Carolina? What's legal? You bet, Billy, it's CBD. And guess what CBD smells like? Just like marijuana. It's the same THC in it of a much lower amount. So really, there's an issue now in North Carolina. The police really should not base a decision to search solely on their own sniff, because it could be CBD. It could be CBD. So that's different. Now, in terms of testing, I don't know if what exactly you mean by that, Crystal. The police may do in the field, they'll do a field test. You bet. And that is whether they can detain you further. So, and I don't know why the city council is not or has not, but I know, or I'm pretty sure that they are aware of it. And they may have, again, they're not going to stop or search or arrest based only on the sniff. There's visual confirmation. There are other things as well. So I'm just bringing this to everybody's attention as well. So now, one thing I haven't gotten to is, can they frisk us if they ask us to get out of the car? It's 2 a.m. Can they frisk us? Are they allowed to do that? Can they frisk our clothing? And the answer actually is no, unless they have reasonable suspicion that we are armed and dangerous. How about if they have reasonable suspicion we have drugs? Not allowed. How about if they just want to do it for their own safety? Not allowed. So this is called a Terry frisk. And you've probably heard of the term Terry stop and frisk. It comes from a case called Terry versus Ohio in Cleveland, Ohio in the 1960s. And can police frisk us on a hunch? No. They have to have reasonable suspicion. They can stop us based on a reasonable suspicion that crime is underfoot. They can then ask us questions, and then they can Frisk us, that's not a full search, but it's on our outer clothing, only if they believe we're armed and dangerous. And then they can take something if it's immediately apparent that it's contraband. So I'm not going to have a lot of time because I'm going to stop in a little bit. It's almost 7 o'clock. And I'm not going to go into warrants or recognized exceptions. But generally, if
Excuse me, Steve.
Yeah.
People are asking questions as you're going along. I would tell you to keep going. I don't know that we need a formal Q&A time.
Okay, that's fine. And I'm fine if they keep asking questions. Please keep them coming. That's fine. More people asking questions, the better I like it. So I'm not just talking all the time. Okay, I'll talk quickly about arrests and search warrants. A warrant gives the police the authority to search us and seize us. But here's what you need. You need 4 things. It has to be about a particular place or person. And the officer who swears it out has to do so under oath. And it has to be before a neutral and detached magistrate, and there must be probable cause to believe there's contraband in a place or that the person who's to be arrested has committed a crime. You need all 4. Now, how long does the magistrate spend on this? Studies show that it's actually only a couple of minutes. I think it's 3 to 4 minutes on the average. So they do this generally pretty quickly, but this is what's required beforehand. Now, the police have to knock, and we've heard of no-knock warrants. And in North Carolina, there is a provision, it's codified in the statutes, saying police don't always have to knock. If it would be futile, or if it would endanger a person's life, or if they would lose evidence. Of course, are no-knock warrants really dangerous these days? Very much so. And here's another thing I didn't say earlier, I'm going to add in now. If you have a concealed carry license and you have a gun in your car, should you tell the officer? I think the answer is yes. Let them know you have concealed carry so they don't see you with a gun and then believe that they're in danger. They need to know that you have concealed carry. They're going to say, get out and please put your hands away. And they're going to ask you where the gun is. So they want to know for their own safety. But here's what I want you to see about warrants. Now, there are a lot of exceptions. And who made these exceptions? Not me. I'm just telling you what the Supreme Court did. So I get to report. Remember the earlier part of today's presentation, we talked about the court and its power? Here's what they say exceptions are. Exigent circumstances. If they're pursuing someone, they'll allowed to chase them in their home. Or the imminent destruction of evidence. They can grab that evidence without a warrant. This means exceptions, no warrants required. Search incident to a lawful arrest. If I'm arrested during a traffic stop, can they search me? Yes, they get a free search every time they have a lawful arrest. They can search me and my wingspan. So if I'm holding a bag, they can search that too. Consent. Do they have to get signed consent? And the answer is no. They don't even have to tell us that we have the right to refuse. Now in Greensboro, they've adopted new rules saying at least they have to tell us we have the right to refuse. Automobiles, because they're mobile, as long as there's probable cause to believe there is in the auto contraband, they can go ahead and search it. They do not need a warrant for that. And if it's in plain view, this is where if they smell marijuana or they see it, they're allowed to search it. How about if the police are lawfully in a house searching it and they see a pipe and they pick it up to determine if there's marijuana in it and they find there is, can they now arrest someone? And the answer is no, because it has to be in plain view. They can't pick it up first. If they go and they smell it just from looking at it, that's enough. And of course, the big one, Terry versus Ohio. Can they stop and frisk us? Yes. In New York, they were doing it indiscriminately. There was a big lawsuit and New York settled it and agreed not to do it. They were doing it in certain neighborhoods. as a way of crime control. No, only if they have reasonable suspicion that a person's armed and dangerous. So I'm going to spend a little time now, instead of doing this, on the Fifth Amendment. Because we've all heard of Miranda. And the Fifth Amendment protects us from being compelled to be a witness against ourselves. So the police stop me and they find contraband on me, let's say a big knife, and they ask me questions. Do I have to answer? Do I have to answer the police questions? And the answer is no. I don't have to answer. If the police stop me before an arrest, can they ask me questions? Yeah. After an arrest, can they ask me questions? Yeah, they can keep asking me questions with few limitations. That's going to be something the police can ask us questions. If I'm asked to come down to the police station, can they ask me questions for a couple hours? Yes, they can. But here's what I want you to know. If we are in custody, and I didn't mean to go this far. If we are in custody and they're interrogating us, any statements we make are not allowed unless Miranda warnings are given first. But we have to be in custody. If we're asked to go down to the police station, are we in custody? And believe it or not, often, no. Custody means we're not free to leave. How about a traffic stop? Are we in custody? And believe it or not, the answer is generally no. It's temporary. So police will ask us a lot of questions like, have you been drinking? They can do that. Now, again, we don't have to answer. But if we're in custody, they better read us our Miranda rights before they ask us questions. That's the key. If we're arrested, are we in custody? What do you think? That's custody. The arrest or an equivalent when we're not free to leave. So sometimes in the police station, if they handcuff us and let us know we're not leaving, we're now in custody. They don't have to formally say you're under arrest. Now, if we're in custody, do we have to talk to them? No, we didn't have to talk to them beforehand either. What percentage of people, after being read Miranda warnings, talk to the police? What do you think? Yep, everyone on Law and Order, too many, you got it. It's over 60% again. It's a huge number. And here we have three choices. You can be silent if you're arrested and you read your Miranda warnings. You can be silent. Or you can invoke your right to silence. You can have to speak. Or a right to an attorney. Or you can waive your rights by essentially talking to them. Which is the best choice of really, there's four here. Which is the best choice of these four? Yep, Crystal and Sue have it. So being silent, there's a famous Supreme Court case about a guy who was silent. Guess how long they asked him questions for? Almost 10 hours. And at the end of the 10 hours, they said, do you believe in God? He said, yes. And do you think God would like it if you didn't talk about your killing this person, essentially? And he said, no. In other words, he confessed to it after 10 hours of interrogation. If you're silent, they can keep asking you questions. There's nothing to stop that after Miranda. And if you blurt something out, that is, without a question, that can be used. Waiver is when you basically are saying, I am going to talk to you. And a lot of people do the waiver. But here's an interesting thing. There's two invocation of rights, silence or an attorney. Which is better? Should you invoke your right to silence or your right to a lawyer? And believe it or not, one is better than the other. And Sue, you got it. If you invoke your right to silence, they can come back within a reasonable time. and ask you more questions. If you invoke your right to a lawyer, they generally have to wait till you have a lawyer present. In other words, no one's going to be asking you questions and you don't have to answer because your lawyer is going to say, don't answer. So what do we get from all this? If you're arrested and given Miranda, what's the general thing? You probably should say, I want my lawyer. Even if you don't have one, say, I'd like my lawyer. How about this? This is a famous case from Louisiana. Person answered, I want my lawyer dog. That's what they said. I want my lawyer dog. What's the problem with that? Sounds weird, doesn't it? I want my lawyer dog. And the problem with that was the Louisiana Supreme Court said that wasn't clear enough. It wasn't unequivocal. And the person actually confessed afterwards, and the court said, we're going to use your confession. So Miranda is really about excluding evidence that's not voluntary. So just like the Fourth Amendment, it's about excluding evidence from trial. And yeah, I don't know where the dog went, but they wanted their lawyer dog, and that was no good. It has to be unequivocally clear. So what do we get from all this? Lots of stuff, right? Lots of stuff. Here's what I would say to you under the Fourth Amendment. The police can do things to us in traffic stops. But if we don't want them to search our car, we can say so if they ask. And for frisks, they generally can't do that unless they have a reasonable suspicion we're armed and dangerous. Once we're in custody and they start asking us questions, they have to read us Miranda if we're going to respond to those questions. And if they read us Miranda, what's the best thing we should do? Not ask for our spouse, partner, parent, child. It's called, I like my lawyer.
Steve, this has been fabulous. We have some questions for you. Are you
Okay.
ready? Do you need to,
Go for
okay. If the police seize my computer, can they force me to give them my passwords?
So here's my first question. Do they have a warrant?
Oh.
And if they don't have a warrant, it better be an exception where they believe there's either the imminent destruction of evidence or another exception that allows them to seize the computer. There is a big conversation going on right now because when people are coming in on the border, which has a lesser degree of privacy under the Fourth Amendment, the Border Control is apparently asking some people, turn on your computer, I want to get in it. So I think there's a real problem that the police officer says, let me see your computer. And Supreme Court says that all the data now are cell phone. It used to be they get a free search of us. If I'm arrested, I'm going to probably have my cell phone with me. I don't know about you. Most people carry their cell phones. And that went to the US Supreme Court. They're allowed to open up boxes in our pockets. So is a cell phone a box? Well, the Supreme Court had no clue because a lot of the people on the Supreme Court were very old and didn't have cell phones until maybe 10 years ago. And now they understand a cell phone is what? Our private lives. So now Supreme Court better have probable cause to open up and go into our phone. So I would say generally, got to watch it, right? They could get a warrant for our computer, or it could be exigent circumstances or some other reason they can go into our computer. And they'll have more of an argument for it at the border. So watch out at the border. Can they search us going through an airport? For borders, yes. They have much more power at those places. It's called special needs. I skipped over that slide, but just like in schools, can they do searches of student lockers? Yes, based on reasonable suspicion. And the border and airports, they can pull us aside and say, we're going to do a search. And they do.
We've got a question that has to do with the expectation of privacy and has to do with strip searches and frisking that may go too far with kids in school. There have been some cases in the paper, well, in the news. What is a reasonable expectation of privacy and strip searching of people not in jail? What's your take on all that?
So the one thing I would say is generally when someone's not in jail, if they're in a school, there's a real problem. And they actually went and had a case involving the strip search of an 8th grader who allegedly had ibuprofen on them. And it went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no way. You can do a lesser search, but this is all about reasonable intrusions. A reasonable search means they have a reasonable intrusion. A big area now is when they can do a blood alcohol test. Now, of course, they do mostly, when it comes to DUIs, they're asking you to blow into a machine. But sometimes they want to do a more accurate test, a blood alcohol test. When are they allowed to do that? That's a search. And they seize some of our blood. So a strip search, unless it's in the prison where rights are much lower, there's still rights in a prison, but a lot lower, it's generally forbidden.
Okay, Fourth Amendment. If a search violates my Fourth Amendment protections and the evidence is thrown out, can they still pursue me for the same charge?
So here's what happens, and this is why it's called the exclusionary rule. It's not in the Fourth Amendment. The Supreme Court essentially made it up. And basically, the evidence gets thrown out, and now the prosecutor is going to ask, can I still prove this case? So when do you have this motion to suppress evidence? Before the trial. Defendants will raise it. Now, sometimes if the defendant loses, they know they're done and they'll plead guilty. So in many cases, it never gets to trial. It depends what the court does with the evidence. And here's what happens. The police stop us. Then it's at night, they frisk us. Then they find something and they reach into a pocket. Then they pull it out and they think, oh, there's contraband, I'm arresting you. And now I'm going to search your car. And then they find the really offensive contraband in the car. But you have all these issues along the way that could be violations of the Fourth Amendment. If the stop was a bad stop, everything else, it's called the fruit of the poisonous tree, and it gets thrown out. So this gets pretty detailed and pretty complicated. So criminal procedure, we just did a really quick overview, but who gets taught this all the time? The police. They're in school. They know as much as my students know. How come? Because they know what the rights are. That's why I think high schoolers, college kids, all of us, we should be knowing what they can do and what they can't do.
Electronic surveillance and the Fourth Amendment. Is electronic surveillance considered the same as, do I have the same rights under the Fourth Amendment or any amendment?
Okay, you're going to get, I can talk about this for a couple hours. Here's why. It used to be Americans hated mass surveillance. The camera looking outside of the stores, the camera on the streets. And then Americans consented to mass surveillance on their own all over the place. And what am I talking about?
9/11.
All of the 9/11, all of the big private companies engage in mass surveillance of us. And part of it's self-caused. It's really what's called the Internet of Things. And I actually just bought an Apple Watch, although I didn't want to do that. I did it for various reasons. I'm tracking myself now, and I know that data is going elsewhere. They have the information highway. So the one thing I would say, first of all, is that information can go to the government without a Fourth Amendment issue. And that's what's happening. The Fourth Amendment is not protecting us against Amazon, against Google. When you go onto these websites and you say there are cookies, those are trackers. There are tracking devices. It's scary if you use one of these trackers, how many people are tracking us to see what our propensities are for advertising. They now have smart billboards. When we go by a billboard, it actually, in smart garbage cans. For the Olympics, they use smart garbage cans that track who came by. They got our phone numbers and they wanted to know what we were doing. It's amazing what they're doing. Our government is tracking us thanks to 9/11. There's a secret court. They do lots of things, mostly abroad. but we're ensnared. But here's what I would say. The Supreme Court's finally saying, you can't track people for 120 days just to find out where they went without any reason. You need some cause. So when it comes to cell site location information, the Supreme Court says, no, you can't give it all to them so they can track everything. So that's a whole area now. We can talk about privacy. People talk about privacy, but we as Americans have pretty much given it up.
That's why the Google data centers are so big.
Huge.
Okay. Does the Fourth Amendment preclude the government from investigating my medical history, such as, and these are from Missouri, I think, keeping track of ovulation and menstruation? And it says, I know that sounds ridiculous, but they're doing it.
Yeah.
Is my medical history or personal bodily functions subject to government record keeping?
So whenever you go to your doctor or medical health professional, you get a HIPAA form. There are federal laws protecting privacy of us with our doctors, with our healthcare providers. But, and this is why I said the Apple Watch, when people are taking all of these measurements themselves and sending it off to a company, that company can give it away and often does to third parties. They actually sell it. So that information is out there and the government can get it through this third party. They can't get it directly from our healthcare providers, their privacy laws. But the minute we start giving it away, and here's one, I can tell you lots of stories, but this is one of them that gets me a lot. In Wisconsin, a guy had a young daughter, I think she was 17, and they started getting mail from Target about things, products that you can use when you're pregnant, and they were addressed to her. And finally, the guy got fed up and went to the Target store and said, I want to see the manager. And he did. And he said to the manager, stop sending my daughter all this stuff about pregnancy. She's 17. And he said, I'm sorry, sir, based on her buying habits, we believe she's pregnant. And he went home and sure enough, she was. The store found out before he did, based on all the data that was out there, just from what we buy. So when people buy with their credit cards and you talk about all the private things, it's out there now. And Target is using it. Other stores are using it. That's why we can get targeted ads. And we are in that situation where other places know about us a lot. They try to anonymize it, as they call it, but it can be de-anonymized pretty readily.
Okay, this one we're going to ask you for a little speculation. I have two that involve speculation. Roe versus Wade.
Yeah.
It's understood by the general public that it sort of reinforced or came from a woman's right to privacy, that privacy was there, even though privacy, I think, is not in the Constitution.
Oh.
Does a law like Texas on the 6-week abortion thing and all that, does that violate women's Fourth Amendment rights?
Okay, so this does not come from the Fourth Amendment at all, believe it or not. It comes from the Due Process Clause, and it's the word liberty in due process. That is, the government can't take away our life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And it has been implied by the Supreme Court. Griswold versus Connecticut, Roe versus Wade, Planned Parenthood v. Casey. There's a lot of cases. And the problem with this area is it's implied by the Supreme Court. Now, is that the only area where rights are implied? No, we talked today about the incorporation doctrine. The first 10 amendments, those that are fundamental to the American scheme of ordered justice, apply to the states. The Supreme Court kind of made that up. It's also not in the due process clause, but they said from due process. So here's what I would say. It's an implied right, which means the court gets to determine the contours. Roe versus Wade was written by Harry Blackmun. Who is Justice Blackmun? An interesting guy from Minnesota who, before he became a justice, was the general counsel at the Mayo Clinic. He knew a lot about science. That's where we got Roe versus Wade. And here's what I would say to you. I don't think it matters what the Supreme Court does with Roe versus Wade. It's already been chipped away to such an extent that it's virtually dead. I hate to put it in those terms, but whether they do anything with it, it's pretty much all, whether they officially overrule it or not, it's virtually dead. Now, the question for me is, does that mean the court's going to take away all the other implied rights of privacy in due process about contraceptives, the right to live with family, the right to go to a private school, and things like that?
If
So,
if the North Carolina legislature passes a law with its own 24-week rule on abortion, is that, if the Supreme Court says, no, this is the rule, can North Carolina set a different rule?
so here's what I would say to you. The North Carolina law has to be consistent with the federal constitution. So if the Supreme Court says that violates the right to choose, and here's how it's determined now, the right to choose is dependent upon an undue burden on a woman, on a woman's right to choose. So undue burden, do we know what that means? It's unclear. It was said in Roe versus Wade at viability. And a lot of people think it shouldn't be at viability, and that's going to be, and essentially one of the arguments that it shouldn't be viability. So and here's the thing, if Roe versus Wade is formally overturned, it doesn't mean abortion is unconstitutional or outlawed. It means it's up to the states to decide. So there will be states that allow abortion, and there will be states that will prohibit it. And so it'll be different in different places in the country.
Wow. Okay, this is the last question that came in, and it'll be our last one tonight. You've been fabulous. Thank you. Court packing. Are you for it or against it?
So
and what do you think of it?
I would say to you that the number 9 is not the number that's prescribed in the Constitution. There have been 9 justices for a long time, but it doesn't mean there have to be 9. And court packing, glad you asked, Jody, is when a president says, I'm going to add justices to the Supreme Court, which is what has been suggested that President Biden does, given the balance on the Supreme Court. First of all, there's no requirement that it has to be even. That's not been the case in history. And actually, early on in history, no one wanted to be on the Supreme Court. They had to ride circuit, literally on horses, to different cities. It was considered a bad job. Now, of course, it's an amazing job. People want it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had his New Deal legislation, kept getting struck down 5-4 by the Supreme Court. So what did he say? I'm adding justices. He threatened to pack the court. And guess what happened? One of the justices flipped and started supporting the New Deal. So this is what they're talking about now. And here's what I would say. You can't just keep changing things because the pendulum swings. So there's going to be a problem there with court packing. I think a bigger problem for our country right now is gerrymandering, named after Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts, where we don't really have that equal right to vote. They now have all these algorithms where they can look in each house and see who voted which way, so that each party is trying to make the state so that it doesn't even matter if we vote. We know who's going to win and who's going to lose. I think that's a really big problem right now.
Steve and everybody who's still here, thank you very much. This has just been a jewel, and it'll be online soon. Jody will get you the link to see it again. And is Love here, Jody?
She left a message in the chat saying that she had to hop
Oh,
off.
okay. And Jody, do you want to say goodbye for the Human Rights Commission?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to close out with a couple of announcements. Sue dropped a message in the chat about a survey. The surveys are really important. They do give us great information. So if you can just take maybe a minute, if that, it's very quick. It's just maybe 4 or 5 questions. Won't take you long at all. But it does give us really great feedback on the development of the survey. The series. The series is being developed as we go. We use your feedback from these surveys to determine what the next topics are. And I just want to say shout out to those of us doing reentry work. We've had some really great news today on driver's license revocation, and there's apparently a ruling on the DMV, the lawsuit against the DMV. So we're excited about that. Just want to highlight that a little bit and say, let's celebrate that little bit of movement. And also mark your calendars. April 14th, we are getting back together again. This time we're going to be talking about transgender rights. We're going to be talking about their rights, access to legal services, legal challenges they face, name changes, and so much more. We've got a really incredible program planned for you. April 14th, I've dropped the registration link in the chat as well. You'll receive an email with all this information in it. But really, thank you for hanging in there with us. Sue, awesome job, as always. David, next time, I'm just going to answer whatever you say. I'm just going to copy because you got all the questions right. So Steve, thank you. This was absolutely incredible.
Thanks,
One of
Rob.
the most informative sessions we've had so far. Really, really wonderful. So y'all have a wonderful night. Enjoy the rest of it, what is left. And make sure you save the date for April 14th.
Jody,
Yes.
so where are you from if you're not a U.S. citizen?
I was born in Bolivia.
Really?
Yeah.
And when are you taking the test? Should we be saying some prayers or something?
Please, I might have to put Steve on retainer. Yeah.